So the News 2 compilation tape had a bit of gold that is barely on Google, certainly not on YouTube. Living on the Edge. There's a news compilation of the hot topic issues of the day. This could have been written this week. Global warming, racial stuff, stuff between the sexes, yeah, everything. Every issue we got going on. Middle East stuff. Russia, all the communist countries getting uncommunist. Oh my gosh. It's amazing. You want to watch the news, and think it's just Jane Pauley looking 30 years younger and Tom Brokaw still on TV. Same with Bryant, actually. Who would have thought Greg Gumbel would outlast Bryant? I think he did. But check this special out. Cool beans. Donald Trump, for all you guys that go nuts on that. It's amazing. Really, really. Watch it. If you're a good boy, we can watch the one about the happy hooker soon.
The following is an NBC special presentation.
Recession. Burned a flag. Saudi Arabia. Killed hostages. Global warming. Africa. Germany. United now for the first time in nearly a folk hero to the west.
The fight isn't about oil. The fight is about naked aggression.
What is going to stop?
If we make the environment sick, it's going to make us sick.
Stocks have fallen 253 points.
The nation's 200 largest banks are likely to fail or need assistance. Can't touch this.
Free speech.
The photos of Robert Mapplethorpe. You can't touch this.
Milli Vanilli sold 7 million copies.
It was an accident, man. A terrible, ghastly mistake.
Story of my life. There are so many things going on in this world. Have we forgotten the problems that are in closest proximity to us? It's the most terrifying time I can remember.
Enough is enough.
I want peace, not war.
Tax increases are necessary.
Crime, drugs.
Good evening. Well, it didn't take us long to learn that the 1990s are not the 1980s. As the first year of the new decade draws to a close, America stands on the brink of war. Our economy either is approaching or it's already in a recession. Our confidence in our political leaders is shaken by the paralysis that grips Washington. 1990, living on the edge.
For the next hour, Tom, Bryant, and I are going to look back at the year past and share some impressions, make some observations, and have some fun. Jokes are a good barometer of what we're really thinking, and if we need to laugh harder during hard times, then it was a vintage year for comedians, as you shall see.
Throughout this evening, we're also going to pay tribute to the giant talents who passed away during the past 12 months. That's the athletes and the singers, the broadcasters and conductors, and yes, to those very public people who we have all to ourselves in the privacy of our homes, the actors, the actresses who so radiantly and so brilliantly filled that very television screen that you're watching tonight.
The invasion by 100,000 Iraqi troops backed by air cover and tanks was brutally efficient.
At 11 o'clock in the morning, I could see from my apartment Iraqi tanks shelling the army post.
Saddam Hussein has more more troops closer to the Kuwaiti border with Saudi Arabia.
There is planning for war tonight at the Pentagon, serious planning.
When you look at vital interests of the United States, the relationship with Saudi Arabia and its independence and its freedom come under the heading of very, very important.
The resolution binds all members of the UN to boycott trade with Iraq.
Elite American combat troops are digging in tonight in Saudi Arabia.
At first, it is to be a defensive strategy to halt an advance of Iraqi armored columns.
Whether those forces are also there to move against Kuwait, who knows?
Margaret Thatcher is offering air, sea, and ground forces.
Egyptian and Moroccan troops began arriving in Saudi Arabia.
The U.S. is showing its muscle, and the threat of war is very real here.
Airmen, soldiers, sailors, the largest force since Vietnam.
Iraqi troops rounded up 28 Americans in Kuwait and took them to Iraq.
We're calling none of them hostages at this point.
Iraq claims it will use foreign captives as a shield for its defense.
There can be little doubt that whatever these innocent people are called, they are in fact hostages.
Are you getting your milk, Stuart?
What if Saddam Hussein just decides to hunker down?
Well, he could try to outlast the economic sanctions and hope Arab public opinion, American public opinion, will turn against George Bush.
If we are going to war, the people have to have a say in this.
We want to exhaust the diplomatic option.
Another 100,000 American troops going to the Persian Gulf.
We're dealing with Hitler revisited.
It's too late to change events. It's time to face the consequence. The delivering the proof is the policy of truth. Never again is what you swore the time before.
I'll guarantee you there ain't going to be any other Vietnam.
The fight isn't about oil. The fight is about naked aggression.
To bring it down to the level of the average American citizen, let me say that means jobs.
With as many as 200,000 more Americans headed for the Gulf, some in Congress are worried that the president might jump the gun.
My dad told me that he said he was going, and he said he'd promise me that he'd come back. And I still believe him.
How do you feel about that, your mom in Saudi Arabia?
I feel like I'm gonna cry.
You make me wanna cry.
Last time I'm going to see my family, my uncle and my father, may never see them again.
Today, the last of the American hostages did leave.
President Bush says the freeing of the hostages does not mean we are closer to a peaceful solution.
If we're going to come over here, we need to come over here, take care of business, get Saddam out of Kuwait, secure his ass, and get on home.
With the UN resolution, the Persian Gulf crisis is about to enter a dramatic new phase. It could be the final phase before military action.
The crisis in the Persian Gulf, it seems to me, demonstrates to all of us very clearly that the end of the Cold War does not make this a less dangerous world in which to live.
You know, the real fear now is as has been stated so often on Capitol Hill, is that the extent of our buildup is such that we have such a large force in place that we run the risk of the force driving the policy, and that's very frightening. That's very frightening.
The fuse gets lit whether we want it to or not, just because the fact is there are so many conditions there that create a kind of spontaneous combustion.
Can I ask a question? Both of you have been there. Isn't this the first military conflict we've been involved in where the television networks have every morning, every evening introduced us individually to the men and women who are serving there, or to the families in the shopping centers that they've left behind, so that on one hand, we have a very strong emotional reason to support the men and women, our servicemen abroad. On the other hand, now that we know them personally, Do we really want to insert them in an all-out military conflict?
Much more a living room war than Vietnam ever was, and it does complicate policy making. If it turns out, however, that it can be solved diplomatically, it will in fact be a kind of triumph of what the President calls the new international order, because the United Nations will have played a major role in it.
Can I ask another question? Will there be a reconsideration of our policy toward an all-volunteer army supported by reserves, now that we have seen the specter of families separated, of fathers separated from wives and children, of mothers separated from husbands and children?
I'd actually like to jump in there. I think there was a method to George Bush's decision to activate reservists, even though he had active troops available to him. It was, in a sense, to democratize the effort. If you recall, when LBJ was at the height of the Vietnam buildup, I mean, part of the problem was that you know, there were certain boys over in this country who were not fighting. There were certain classes of people who were not fighting the war. And I think in calling up the reserves as he has, George Bush has democratized the effort and therefore attempted to broaden his base of support.
The other thing I think, Jane, is that a lot of people will look at joining the Army in a much different light now, because it does mean that you've got to pick up your weapon and go off to a desert area thousands of miles from home and face the possibility of firing it and, more importantly, being fired back upon. When you stand on that desert and look north all the way to Iraq, you realize the kind of conditions that we have exposed these young men and women to, and we hope that our technology and their training will mean that they're up to it. But as I stood there during the Thanksgiving visit of President Bush, I was reminded of the Roman legions scattered across some plain somewhere, because as far as the eye could see, men and equipment and no place to hide.
And time is never planned. It's not on any chart. You must find it with your heart. Never, never land. And that's my home where dreams are born. And time is never planned. Just think of lovely things, and your heart will fly on wings forever. In never, never
As you know, ladies and gentlemen, I'm sure you know this, the bad news is the government has been shut down, but the good news is the government has been shut down. Oh, yes.
President Bush is enjoying exceptional popularity. His approval rating is the highest given any president since we started polling 14 years ago.
The President of the United States.
Fill my heart with song and let me sing forevermore. You are all I long for, all I worship and adore.
The President has concluded that tax increases are necessary.
Bush tonight finds himself getting the sharpest criticism from his own political party.
The Republican Party has met the executioner, and he's living in a big white house on Pennsylvania Avenue.
The budget talks, frankly, are stalled now.
The budget summit, it collapsed today.
What we're watching tonight is a federal government in gridlock.
It's been going on for 5 months now. The toing and froing, the missed deadlines, the agonizing.
Tonight they are looking for a way to tax the rich and still please the president.
The hang-up is not capital gains.
And the folks back home want Congress to stop fighting and just pass that budget. At the same time, no one wants to pay for it.
Get back to work, suck it up, and get it done.
Well, they've done it, finally. Congress has passed a new budget.
Americans who expressed record confidence in Mr. Bush through August are now beginning to show serious doubt.
The administration and public polls show a sharp drop in his approval rating.
Blame me.
Have you had enough?
It's time for the American people to just rise up and take our country back from the career politicians.
On this election night, 1990, the American voters are not tearing up the political landscape, but they are altering it some. Taxes and the economy have proved to be some traps for Republicans and Democrats alike.
The headline is that 97% of House and Senate incumbents were reelected.
Can't touch this.
A highly popular sitting president faced an off-year election, and when the verdict was done, we came out unsure. Why?
20 years ago, in advertising, I am told, there was a spate of coffee commercials wherein we learned that, ooh, this cup of coffee tastes bitter. Well, mine is smooth and rich. And all the coffee companies were advertising with this message, ooh, this one's bitter and this one's better. What people learned from these commercials was that coffee didn't taste good, and they bought less coffee.
Mm-hmm. Not that they chose one over the other.
Right.
Sure.
Negative advertisements have the result of leaving people not with the message that you're the good guy, he's the bad guy, but that, well, they're all bums, so why bother?
Right. Sure. Or the alternative being, and the polls showed this to be true, that people were fed up with Congress, but like their congressman.
Yeah. I also think that the people that we all have a part in all of this. We just can't point toward Washington and say it's their fault. That real reform does have to come from a kind of grassroots, populist kind of movement of some kind, and that people, if they're not happy and if they believe that there are real problems that are not getting solved, are going to have to step up to them on their own, in their own communities, in their own states, and there is some evidence in some of those states.
Well, but just as disturbing on the other side is the percentage of those who vote continues to shrink.
Right.
And the percentage of those who step up to the trough and even want to try to attempt to make a difference is also shrinking. The fact of the matter is there were a number of representatives who were considered vulnerable who were unopposed in this past election. Now, why were they unopposed? Is it because fundraising is harder than ever? Probably so. Is it because the scrutiny they must bear is worse than it's ever been? Probably so. But maybe more than that, it's also because those who are in power are more invulnerable than they have ever been.
When Charles Keating was asked once whether the millions of dollars he gave to politicians bought him influence, he was blunt.
I want to say in the most forceful way that I can, I certainly hope so.
Many of our fellow citizens apparently believe that your services were bought by Charles Keating, that you were bribed, that you sold your office.
We look at the S&L mess, and we can't find anybody to pin it on, even though it's going to wind up costing us in excess of $300 billion. And maybe what winds up happening is we find the Keating Five very convenient, if not terribly guilty. Jay Leno had a great joke.
Here's another interesting thing. It was in the paper today. A company has just come out with trading cards. These are like baseball cards, except they depict members of the United States Senate. Is that a good idea? I mean, why would someone buy a card of a senator when you can own the real thing so easily? Gosh, it seems silly.
It'd be a terrific line if it wasn't so sad. But I think that's what people are looking for. They're looking for fall guys. They're looking for somebody to say he did it, because if he didn't, we did.
I hate to say that it's a general description of the state of our culture, but it occurred to me just recently that we may have seen the closing bell of the 80s when Milli Vanilli was revealed not to have sung a note on their record album that won them a Grammy.
And the best new artist is Milli Vanilli.
And when the record company executive, when asked if he was embarrassed by that result, said, "Are you kidding? We sold 7 million copies."
It's not that easy being green, having to spend each day the color of the leaves, when I think it could be nicer being red or yellow or gold, or something much more colorful like that. When green is all there is to be, it could make you wonder why. But why wonder? Why wonder? I'm green, and it'll do fine. It's beautiful. and I think it's what I want to be.
Cream stand in Moscow, and they have a flavor called Gorba chocolate. That's true. No, it's named after Gorbachev. That's right. See, if they really wanted a flavor that depicted Gorbachev, they should have called it Rocky Road. Boy, that's where, Gorbachev. Not too popular at home, Gorby, there.
Gorbachev wins the Nobel Peace Prize, but there are no cheers at home.
The Soviet people should receive the Nobel Prize for our suffering.
Shortages of bread, sugar, eggs, meat, and now potatoes.
The population's half starved now.
We were told that the state will always take care of you, but that was a big lie.
Gorbachev on a collision course with Boris Yeltsin.
The man who was once President Mikhail Gorbachev's political ally is now his major critic.
Protesters in Red Square jeered them and shouted, "Resign."
Some delegates warned Shevardnadze's resignation would play into conservative hands.
Fellow Democrats and reformers have slunk into the bushes. A dictatorship is on the offensive.
In the Soviet Union tonight, a major showdown over independence from Lithuania.
Moldavian militiamen shot and killed 6 Russian.
The 14th of the 15 Soviet republics to declare itself either independent or sovereign.
We want our own republic.
Nelson Mandela, free at last and back among his people.
Nelson Mandela is back in town!
We're fighting with everything we have to secure that there will be no domination of black people over whites.
Blacks are killing blacks in a steadily worsening tribal war.
We've been here since 1600. It's a long time. Why should we leave?
Apartheid has no future. Nothing will stop our date with destiny.
Began with Palestinians throwing stones at Jews. It ended with Israeli police opening fire.
The greatest slaughter since Israel occupied the West Bank in 1967.
Palestinians have no other alternative but to continue with their intifada.
Vows of revenge tonight for the assassination of Rabbi Meir Kahane.
I hope that tens more will die and will suffer.
China surprised the world today by letting go one of its most famous dissidents, Fang Lejour. Robert Polhill is free. Hostage Frank Reed free.
Brian Keenan reached Damascus, Syria today after 4 years held hostage in Lebanon.
All the food in the world, drink all the drink in the world. Make love, I hope, to all the women in the world.
The new president of Nicaragua, Violeta Chamorro. What now for Daniel Ortega?
Noriega sent word that he would surrender to U.S. authorities.
It's one of Margaret Thatcher's last orders as prime minister.
At 7:30 this morning, she decided to resign.
She will be remembered as the greatest peacetime prime minister this country has ever had.
Romania will do something it hasn't done in more than half a century. It will hold free elections.
100,000 people jammed Prague's Wenceslas Square, demanding the total abolition of the Communist Party before June's parliamentary elections.
Now Hungarians must choose the political leaders to replace those who followed the Red Star.
After 45 years of communist rule, the Poles have elected a president, Lech Walesa.
Not West Germany, not East Germany, just Germany. United now for the first time in nearly half a century.
Shaped by political freedom and prosperity on one side, oppression and the failure of communism on the other. I think one of the greatest symbols of the lightning speed with which the world has been changing is what happened in Germany. It was within 11 months of the Berlin Wall coming down, a whole new nation was reborn again at a cost of $775 billion. The West Germans stepped up, wrote the check, and said, "We are one once again." That's an astonishing statement on their part of their confidence in themselves, when in this country we'll spend almost as much money on savings and loans, and at the end of it all, what will we have? Certainly not a new nation.
But do you not think, Tom, that, and I can recall that night, I mean, you and I standing there next to Brandenburg Gate and watching the celebration below. I mean, what happened in Berlin almost capsulizes what's happening throughout the world, in that there is this tremendous rush to freedom. There's this great exhilaration, and then comes the dawn, is the reality of what it's going to cost. Yeah. And the exhilaration fades very rapidly.
You got to go back and strap on the plow the next morning.
Speaking of exhilaration, we were talking a year ago about watching you at the Berlin Wall, and there I was at home watching with tears down my face and explaining to my little daughter this thrilling thing that had happened. I was so surprised to learn that the television ratings were not extraordinary, which raises the question, where were we that night? It also raises the question, do we really have much interest in what happens around the world? Americans have a long tradition of isolationism, and I suspect that we are hard upon a period of that as well. Gorbachev, Noriega, Mandela, Saddam Hussein, our good guys, our villains, whoever, we personalize them, but do we care about the Soviet Union behind Gorbachev? Probably not as much.
No, we care about the theater. We care about the larger players on the world stage. But I think that there is so much anxiety about what we have going on in our own country right now that we just don't know.
Unemployment held steady last month at 5.3%.
The Federal Reserve governors and the presidents of the reserve banks foresee continued moderate economic expansion over 1990.
Drexel Burnham Lambert, now bankrupt, laid off thousands of workers as it continued its dramatic decline. The stock market, however, continues to run like a bull, just shy of the 3,000 mark.
The Donald defaulted on payments of almost $20 million.
We really are right on the edge of a recession.
It's certainly not a recession. I believe we are already in a recession.
Since the invasion of Kuwait on August 2nd, stocks have fallen 253 points.
Real estate is going down and staying down.
You can't have home prices going up 25% and 30% a year and incomes going up 6% and 7% a year.
We're just going to sit here and ride it out. We don't want to be one of the ones that give our house away.
35 of the nation's 200 largest banks are likely to fail or need assistance within the next year.
Good evening. The numbers just keep on coming on the economy, none of them good.
Traders pushed the price of crude oil to an all-time high, $40 a barrel.
It's easily going to cost me an extra $60, $70 a week.
Why do we have to move?
Your father lost his job. They closed the plant.
Why?
A lot of people are buying clothes made in other countries, not ours.
Buy American and Americans work.
When you make $14 an hour and the system is offering 5 or 6 at the most, you have a family of 5 or 6 or better, it calls for an impossible situation economically.
Chrysler said today it is running on red ink.
U.S. Air has announced 3,600 layoffs, Pan Am 2,500.
We're not really poverty-stricken, but I think things are tougher on us. And I worked so hard, and so did my husband, to get to this point where we could really enjoy ourselves, and it just hasn't happened yet.
You want to pay the rent. You don't want to go back out there to the street.
I must say that if you listen to the private conversations of the so-called wise men of the financial community, it's the most terrifying time I can remember. I mean, they think that the bottom has fallen out, and what you see is a kind of short but very painful recession from them, or a long, long slide with no bottom in sight.
I guess there are a lot of economists right now who will tell you that the real crunch is that small businesses, which accounted for, I think, something like 80% of all the new jobs created during the boom years, those small businesses now can't get loans.
Because the banks are in trouble.
They can't get loans from banks that are in trouble because they've overextended themselves in the real estate market, but also because the banks are more cautious than they were, because the government regulators, having been burned by the S&L mess, are now more vigilant than they ever were. And so what happens is it starts to feed upon itself, and which is why Alan Greenspan says it feels worse than it really is.
Yeah, I think that just generally the American people feel that somehow we've lost our way, however. And I think there's just an enormous loss of confidence in this country in terms of what we can do economically, and that's a big piece of it.
Can I raise just a personal, completely personal anecdote that I wonder if it's relevant? I got a letter from a college professor who was looking through old transcripts, old class rosters in 1970, among 350-some kids. I was in his American history class. I remember the class vividly, as he reminded me. He assigned 13 books in the course of the semester, so every Friday we had a quiz. I remember it because I never went to sleep on Thursday night reading these books for the quiz. The point of the letter was that the same course today, college class, he can assign 7 books, not 13, because the students survey the syllabus for courses that are easier. Mm-hmm. He can assign books of no more than 200 pages in length. Mm-hmm. Now, this concerns me because I was not an overworked college student. But in 1970, we were doing twice the work that today's college students feel is acceptable. And
by any, I think, any standard, if you go to any community in America of some size and say, what kind of confidence do you have in your public school system? People will say, well, gee, not very much, and they know that we're not competing.
But I'm so used to hear her say, good morning every day. Her joys, her woes, her highs, her lows are second nature to me now. Like breathing out and breathing in. I'm very grateful she's a woman and so easy to forget. Rather like a habit one can always break. I've grown accustomed to the trace of something in the air, accustomed to her face.
Living on the Edge will continue.
Paper is full of strange news items, and a Tennessee court has just ordered a divorced couple to share custody of 7 frozen embryos. Don't you kind of miss the old-fashioned way of having a family? Nowadays, your kid arrives with a label that says, remove foil and microwave on high for 4 to 6 minutes.
You know, even as we celebrated all the advancements of 1990, particularly in the medical field, I think there was increasing evidence that we are ill-prepared to deal with the ramifications of what they deliver to us.
His suit refers to the couple's 7 frozen embryos as property jointly owned.
It will be 6 months before the baby is big enough to serve as a marrow donor.
An unidentified 4-year-old girl is the first human to undergo a gene transplant.
This should provide cures for what are presently incurable diseases.
Nancy Cruzan, the auto crash victim who lay in a coma for 8 years while her parents waged a right-to-die battle, died this morning.
If we could ask Nancy what she would want, she would say, turn me loose, set me free, let me go. The family of the woman who died using the suicide machine says there is no question that she knew what she wanted and got it.
The ability of science to produce technology is well ahead of our ability to decide what we want to do with it and how. But we're not making those decisions.
Having a child, the California surrogate case, where an embryo was conceived with the mother's egg, the father's sperm, but grown in a surrogate mother's womb. Before the child is born, she sues for custody. Evidently, the biological parents have custody, but the surrogate mother will have visitation. We sure do. We are getting to know what the questions are. Yeah. We just haven't.
We don't have the answers, though.
Right.
All I'm asking you to do is to send the message out again that here in Louisiana, we'll no longer allow people to choose to murder unborn children.
The idea is simple: a pill that induces abortion.
Many called this pill the biggest medical breakthrough for women since the birth control pill.
A major Supreme Court decision on abortion. It is legal to require parents' notification.
What should be done with Roe v. Wade if that case were brought before me? I will listen to both sides of that case.
Where do we find ourselves at the back end of 1990 on abortion? I would suggest that what we have found is, instead of it being this terribly splitting issue, that there are 10% who are here and there are 10% who are there, and that most of us fall into this very large middle and just let it go unaddressed.
I think
may not really be a fan of it, but are also not a fan of telling anybody what to do, and so just want to let it be, let it rest.
No, but we do have to be prepared for the next Supreme Court decision on it, which will reignite it in one way or another, however briefly or however long. That's something that we're going to have to watch for in the coming year.
David Souter's name should come up again at that time.
I would think so.
But don't you think the pro-lifers now, Tom and Jane, don't you think that they are, if anything now, a little reticent to make it an issue? Because experience has shown that when they make it an issue, they lose.
Yeah, they have not done well politically, and they are, and if nothing else, they are a smart political movement.
You needed that job, and you were the best qualified, but they had to give it to a minority because of a racial quota. Is that really fair? For racial quotas, Harvey Gantt. Against racial quotas, Jesse Helms.
1990 unfortunately gave ample evidence of our historic inability to come to grips with our racial differences. Are we rushing towards two disparate societies?
Yeah, I think it's the most disheartened I've been on that issue in my adult lifetime, Brian. I became an adult reporter in the 1960s, and one of the first big stories that I covered and cared more about than any other was the civil rights movement. And what distresses me greatly in the 1990s is that it's not on the agenda in a public way in the way it was in the 1960s. It's not on the administration agenda. There's an absence of goodwill, I think, among black people and among white people and among people of color generally, white, brown, whatever.
I'm afraid I'm with you on that. I mean, on the one side, blacks saying there is no effort to even be of some assistance here, and that everything you do is tinged with racism. And on the white side, there is that we've gone far enough, and now the pendulum has swung the other way, and we want our rights back.
Appreciate it. David Duke is the name. He was a high official in the Ku Klux Klan. Today, he is a candidate running for the U.S. Senate.
He is saying what all of us have been feeling. They know what David Duke's saying. He doesn't have to come out and say the word nigger. They know how he feels.
If any comfort to be found on the subject, isn't it in Douglas Wilder of being elected governor of Virginia? Isn't it Gary Franks being elected Republican, conservative congressman from
Harvey Gantt getting nominated in North Carolina. Right.
Yeah, Gantt didn't win, but he certainly ran a more than respectable race. We are perhaps most aware of urban polarization. Bensonhurst, the jogger trial. Marion Barry certainly polarized the issue in Washington. Boston has had more than one opportunity to have polarization, but perhaps in the country at large, perhaps it's not as bad as that, and perhaps these are signs equally worthy.
Well, I think those are heartening signs, James, but here's the caveat. It very quickly becomes polarized. It happens in New York with the black mayor, David Dinkins, and pretty soon many of his black office holders are saying, well, you wouldn't say that about us if we weren't black, about not solving these problems. You're making a racist judgment here. And white people are saying, well, they're not up to it. They are not up to it.
Worse yet, the problems, you've got to believe, are only going to be exacerbated by the economic problems to come. Because ultimately, racial differences are rooted in economic fears. And when it comes time for jobs, that's where you're going to see people splitting along racial lines. I'm with you. I find it very difficult to be optimistic.
I knew a man, Bojangles, and he danced for you in worn-out shoes. He looked to me to be the very eyes of age. As he spoke right out, talked of life, talked of life, laughed slapped his leg a step. That was Mr. Bojangles. Mr. Bojangles. Mr. Bojangles.
On this date, just a little historical fact. How many of you know this? Francis Scott Key wrote The Star-Spangled Banner. And it's nice to realize that his last days were made easier, knowing that he wouldn't live to hear Roseanne Barr sing it.
Though most Americans would be hard-pressed to actually cite their First Amendment rights, the fact of the matter is First Amendment rights were often in the news in 1990 from the photos of Robert Mapplethorpe in Cincinnati.
All leave the premises while the police make a videotape of the exhibition.
To the performance of Two Live Crew in Florida. On through to Roseanne Barr singing, if I may call it that, of the national anthem in San Diego. Sensibilities were offended. To what end?
Well, I think we learned that that we have two priorities. We want to protect free speech, but we all also want to protect our ability, our right to say out loud, that stinks. You know, yeah. That you have the right to express yourself in whatever manner, but I also have the right to say that goes beyond the bounds of what I think are acceptable behavior.
Take the flag burning issue. One of the great hot buttons in our society. I mean, it pushed it for a lot of people, and I think that you could say to some citizens, do you think that we ought to have capital punishment for flag burners? And they'd say yes.
The flag stands for the Republic. Are we going to desecrate the Republic? Are we going to destroy the Republic?
But then, in the coolness of the next day, all the polling indicated that people thought that we were going too far to make that some kind of a constitutional amendment or a felony of one kind.
Is that because they thought we were going too far, or because they lost interest in it?
Well, maybe a combination of the two, but they also begin to think about their own liberties and what they want to be able to do in their own household, and we do become really very jealous in this country of our freedom to say what we want to and where and how we want to.
Somebody once said, First Amendment gives you the right to speak your mind, but not necessarily be taken seriously.
Right.
Who, after 1990, will remember who Andrew Dice Clay was? The marketplace spoke and said, who cares?
I'm free to do what I want any old time. I said I'm free to do what I want any old time.
Used to where there'd be 3 and 4 drug dealers on the corner. Now you got a dozen of them.
There's not a minute to spare.
More drugs, more money, more guns, more violence.
A lawyer who stepped into this store walked into a turf battle between drug dealers and died in the gunfire.
Gone. I dialed 911 a long time ago.
Stray gunshots hit 12 children this summer, killing 5.
The problem has gotten totally out of hand.
There have always been pockets of criminality, but this is pervasive and nonstop. This is shooting in the streets, and the wrong people have guns.
When you hear the shot, you just try to run, you try to get out the way or something.
Hit me!
The murder rate among youngsters in their late teens is the highest of any age group in America, triple the murder rate for the rest of the population.
It's just like war on the street.
There's not a minute to spare.
Yeah, I think about it every night. And I pray to God that I'll make it.
Well, at the end of 1990, New York City and a number of other cities Can claim the dubious distinction of having set new murder records in New York City past the 2,000 mark in mid-December. Boston, a District of Columbia, Milwaukee, among others, set new records for homicides. People have good reason to fear for their personal safety. What is the reason? Is it drugs and crack?
Well, some of it is driven by drugs, yeah. A lot of it is driven by crack in the inner cities. They've got to have the money.
A lot of it is driven, too, by the sheer availability of guns.
Right.
It continues to be one of the great tragedies of this nation that in poll after poll, the American public steps forward and says that they want some control over these guns, and yet it never happens. It never comes to pass.
But let's face it. If you broadcast the message that it's not safe out there, that you're not even safe in your own home, the other response is, well, how do I get some measure of control?
Well, that would be terrific if the gun provided you control. But the fact of the matter is, the evidence suggests that the gun you buy, you're not going to protect yourself with. You instead, the odds are, I think, something like 93% that you will turn it on someone you know. And that's the real tragedy here. We're heading towards almost 25,000 murders nationwide this year.
Yeah, guns and drugs, cancer. I mean, it really is in our society, and we have treated some of the symptoms, but the fact of the matter is that, especially with drugs, as we enter this decade, for all the attention that they received in the 1980s, they remain an enormous problem, especially in the inner city, and too much of this country, in my judgment, is willing to look the other way because they say, well, it's not my neighborhood, and I think it's a terrible commentary on moral values.
Hello?
Mr. O'Reilly, this is the MCI operator. I have a call from New York.
Hi, Uncle Mike.
Trish?
I have a little surprise for you.
Mrs. O'Reilly, I have a call from New York and San Diego.
Hello?
A call from the United States for Seamus O'Reilly.
I'll try and find him. He's in Ireland.
This is Meg O'Reilly.
Sarge, line 1. O'Reilly.
You're still chasing the bad guy, Sean.
Who is it?
It's everybody. I can't believe this.
Hello?
Seamus!
Who's this?
Happy New Year, Seamus!
Should old acquaintance be forgot?
For old lang syne, we'll take a cup of pines, yeah.
Traditional Oriental wisdom says one must live well, eat well, which may explain why, for generations, their diet has included brown rice, including the bran. Kellogg's brings this ancient yet new idea to the American breakfast in Ken My Rice Bran. Here's brown rice with all its nutritious bran in crisp, delicious flakes. Ken My Rice Bran from Kellogg's, born in the tradition of lifelong health. Live well, eat well.
I think the good news is that the problems that we face have been there all along. They have just been under wraps, so to speak, and maybe I feel a little bit better once they stand up and we can take the measure of them and get going. I have confidence in the 90s.
Tom, we always get to this point, and we're always a bit surprised at how much has gone before and a little bit of excited about what lies ahead, and maybe the best closing thought about it all I ever heard came from that wise old sage, Yogi Berra, who once said the future's just like the present, only longer.
Yeah, that's true indeed. Well, it does seem to me that the year 2000 may have already started in the year 1990. We seem to be rushing the decade like we are everything else, but I do hope that the 1990s do provide us all with an opportunity for some accountability. Finally, some memorable images from 1990. And for Jane and for Bryant, for myself, good night, and have a happy new 1991.
Next, Angie Dickinson stars as a cop whose hunt for a serial killer could make her the next victim. Charles Durning and David Soul co-star in Prime Target. And next Sunday,
2 unique new shows, 1 extraordinary new hour of television. I'm Jane Pauley. Join me for Real Life, followed by Expose with Tom Brokaw. Premiering Sunday.
You know we're all in this world.
Thanks for watching Cleveland Live Music. It's awfully bright out here. I'd click on another one of my videos. Quit looking into the sun. Your mother told you not to do that. Please hit the subscribe button. And if you want to support the channel more, there's GoFundMe and Patreon information in the video descriptions. Ooh, ooh!